Hi there, welcome to Not Your Average Goat. I'm your host, Teisha Gillespie, and this is a show that celebrates all the shapes, sizes, and colors of diversity as well as adversity. Through authentic conversations, we hope to have an impact on dismantling societal stigma while creating a place for relatable storytelling. Welcome, Cait. I'm so excited to have you. I know that you've published a lot of stuff like blog articles before in your time, but your book just came out. Does that feel any different for you, like being a published author of a book?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. And yeah, I'm still processing all my feelings about it because, I worked on this book for years and there's a lot of buildup and now it's out in the world and I don't feel like it belongs to me anymore. It belongs to the readers. So I'm still processing a little bit of, I don't know, a little grief, a little excitement. I really feel happy about it though, overall.
That's awesome. I love that perspective of, now that the book is out in the world, that, you really did create it to help others as they're potentially navigating a similar journey to yours. And I remember when I first came across you, I believe it was on Threads, and I saw a post of you kind of previewing your memoir and talking about briefly about your journey with religious trauma and the Christian patriarchy. And I didn't really know the ins and outs of your journey just yet. I have read your book in full now, so I know so much about you. But I also remember growing up and having some experiences with religious trauma, somewhat different from what you experienced, but I could definitely relate and empathize. And so I really wanted to know more and learn more about you because one thing I really try to achieve with this show is creating that space for relatable storytelling because I think there's so much power in finding someone who's had a similar or adjacent experience to you because it makes you feel like you're not alone in the world and that there's someone there who understands you and who sees you. So I appreciate you putting this book out. And I know we're going to dive in a little bit more soon, but I just wanted to say that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that's my hope is that it can connect with people. I know that some aspects of my story might seem extreme fundamentalist, but I know that there's a spectrum of these experiences, and so I hope it does resonate.
Well, Cait, the first thing I like to do with everyone on this podcast is to kind of time travel back. And I know a lot of what we're going to talk about is going to be almost kind of like a time travel, but I like to go really far back to like 7, 9-year-old
Mm.
Cait. And can you tell me what you remember about her? Like, what were your interests? How, if at all, was your personality different from today? What do you remember about 7, 9-year-old Cait?
I remember I was homeschooled at that point. So I was living in Pennsylvania, and I really loved being outside. And I remember waiting for the neighborhood girls to come home from school so that I could actually play with them after homeschool. I feel like I didn't know what was coming or what my life was going to be like at that point. There was parts of me that just was a kid. I was pretty innocent at that point, even though I had already been exposed to a lot of these patriarchal ideas.
So you grew up, you kind of started in Pennsylvania, but you and your family moved all over the place. And you kind of came from a semi-big family. I'm actually from a family of 7 children, so
Okay.
not as big. But I still recognize that being the third of 4 children is still kind of, that's still kind of like a handful.
Well, I have two older siblings and then a younger sibling. So my older sister and my older brother, there's a 6 year gap between us, between me and my older brother, and then my sister's 9 years older than me. So it did feel like there were two sets of kids in the house. When I was little, they were going through their teen years, and I witnessed, you know, their adolescent behavior and how they would get in trouble and how my dad would punish them. And I learned by witnessing that how to be a really good rule follower. So I was a very quiet child. I followed all the rules. I didn't want to get spanked. and became very much a people pleaser. And so the dynamics with my siblings, that's really annoying to your other siblings when you're that good at not getting in trouble and they are getting in trouble a lot. So I wasn't exactly the favorite among my siblings, because I was a little bit of a goody two shoes, if I'm honest. And my younger brother, he's 3 years younger than me, so we grew up more together and we're homeschooled together. In terms of moving, I was born in Delaware. We moved to Pennsylvania a few years later, and then moved to Colorado when I was 10, moved to Hawaii when I was 18, and we moved between houses often in between all those bigger moves. So I moved around a lot, and the reasons I was given was for my dad's job, and he wasn't in the military or anything like that. People often ask me if that's what it was, but really he would get this idea of getting a new job and starting over. And so we would make this big move. Um, for instance, from Pennsylvania to Colorado, he wanted to start his own business. So we moved to the mountains in Colorado and he started his own business. And then 8 years later, he wanted to live in Hawaii and join a company there. So we moved there. So it was always about my dad's work. And looking back, I think there was some bridge burning involved in that. I can only speculate about the reasoning. And yeah, I mean, now it's interesting because when I tell that to like a therapist, they will point out that moving around a lot can often be traumatic for children going through childhood development. And so I never thought of it that way, but it was a very disruptive childhood. I never felt quite at home. Well, first, I didn't feel at home in my body
Mhm.
because of the way we were raised. I felt very disconnected from my sense of self. I lost that completely almost. And then moving around a lot, I didn't establish very many friendships. And then being homeschooled on top of that, I didn't get a lot of socialization. So it was a very isolating way to grow up. And yeah, it was disruptive in that sense. I always thought that Pennsylvania like would have been home, but now it doesn't feel like that anymore either because I've moved around so much. I don't think of a specific place as going home anymore.
So you were raised in a quite religious household, patriarchy, Christian household. And I'm wondering for you, when you think back again, is there a specific memory that stands out to you that initially anchors you to the Christian religion, kind of like one of those first memories that you were aware of?
I'm very young, going to vacation Bible school, Sunday school, being in church every Sunday. It's always been such a big part of my family's life. So I don't really have a first memory, but it was always the structure, like the framework of how we lived. And I have this early memory of we lived in near Lancaster, Pennsylvania, so near the Amish community. And I remember seeing I'm not sure, I can't remember if they were Mennonite or Amish women out when I was at a playground and being struck by the way they dressed and curious about that. And then, I was instructed about how my family followed what they said was the true Christian religion. And that was a different kind of religion. So I always could understand that we were different, both from, more exclusive communities like the Amish, but also um, what my family would have called like liberal Christians or people who didn't really believe the Bible, but pretended to be Christians. So it's interesting that the Amish community was a contrast at that time because over the years, it felt like our family became more and more secluded and lived more like that kind of religious isolation.
Mhm. And I think too, I also grew up in a Christian household as well. But I think even when I was younger, I think most of mainstream US kind of looked at the Amish and at least the portrayal of them in the media and kind of thought them to be the most isolated in a way with all of their traditions that really kind of kept them off the grid in a way from the
Mm.
rest of the world. Um, so it's interesting that you talk about, this quote unquote true Christianity and kind of like the liberal Christianity versus, the right way of doing things, because I can kind of remember being a child too, and knowing families or folks who identified as Christian, but I would see them doing things that I knew my family would never participate in, or if I had tried doing it, I would have, been reprimanded for doing it. And I remember one specific moment. This is when I was a teenager. I had quote unquote grown up with this family. It was a mother, father, a son, and a daughter. And the son was a year older than me, and the daughter, I think, was a year or two younger than me. So I was pretty close in age to both of them. Um, we lived in Florida together, and then we drifted apart. And when I was home back in Maryland, where I spent most of my childhood, I remember we reconnected with that family virtually over the phone when I was about 14 or 15. And I remember reconnecting with my former friend, Ken. We started talking on the phone, just as friends. And I remember after one of my conversations with Ken, I went into the kitchen to talk to my mom. And she was like, "Oh, you're already finished with your phone call." And I was like, "Yeah." Ken was going over to his girlfriends to hang out for a little bit. And I remember her saying, "Oh, they weren't really Christians ever."
Wow.
Because my mom was a firm believer. And so I think this is kind of where I was very intrigued by your story, because for the most part, I was raised by a single mother. So
Mhm.
I didn't really have the patriarch part in my life for a very long time. And I had a stepfather, but he almost in a way was submissive to my mom. And so my mom kind of tried to play that role in a way. And I remember she was very, very firm on what we call dating. And I know we're going to kind of talk about courtship and how that's a little bit different. But she believed that you were not allowed to date until you were 18. And then I even remember one time she was like, you were only allowed to, like, you might be able to kiss someone, but you must be at least like 16 to do so. And I just remember thinking that's so weird. Even back then, I was like, how? I was like, kissing shouldn't be something that you kind of plan for. And it's like, it sounds like you were rehearsed like a play.
Right.
And so I remember kind of thinking that too, that there were just certain things that other people who call themselves Christians were allowed to do or participate in. And I wasn't. Like, I even remember other people being able to watch quote unquote secular TV and listen to secular music, but I was never allowed to do that. I had to just listen to kind of gospel, or, finally at some point, they had like new kind of Christian bands come out to like kind of punk
Mhm.
rock and pop and stuff like that, which helped a little bit. But yeah, I just remember it just being so limiting as a child. And so I'm kind of wondering from your perspective, when you did interact with other families or children, what did you notice that was like significant or different from your experience?
Well, I could sense a difference between me and the neighborhood kids because they would go to public school. They had that was the early days of when the internet came out, and so dial-up internet, they could go on the internet, which I wasn't allowed to do, and they just seemed to have more freedom in their day-to-day life. And then we always went to churches that supported or were in the same vein as my family's rules. So I didn't see a difference too much between me and the other kids in the church that we went to. But I could tell the difference between me and the neighborhood kids. And for a brief time, I went to a Christian private school in kindergarten, and I felt very different then too. And I'm not sure if that's personality wise or what exactly, but I always felt very different from other people. Anytime we would hang out with or, see other homeschoolers, you could tell the families that were had more strict rules and those who didn't. And then just learning the different variations of rules we all had. So like We were allowed to watch some Disney movies, but some families weren't. On the other hand, we couldn't, go out with friends and go to the movies with our friends, and other people could. So it was just like these like arbitrary, in my opinion, arbitrary rules that set us apart from other people. And it was just, you have to follow the rules and that's it. There's no other options. There's no freedom to be an individual self in our family structure. And so I would see like my cousins, they would listen to music and I was like, wow, they get to pick their own music that they listen to. I was very confused because I didn't know how to answer questions like what kind of music do you like? Like I don't know. I listen to whatever my dad listens to. So I didn't have those abilities to explore my individuality when I was a kid.
I remember not being able to go many places with my friends. I was rarely ever allowed to go to someone's house or like do a sleepover. And so most of the time, I would have to invite friends over to my house. And that, I think, created a bigger, kind of put like a bigger, like, sign on me saying you are different, kind of inviting other people into
Yeah.
my home and getting that direct access to the rules and traditions that I was also exposed to. Friends would come over and, they would want to watch something or listen to something or go somewhere. And I was like, well, I can't do that. And so it would get to a certain point, that friends in elementary school ages or even in the beginning of junior high, where they would be okay with that. But then once I got into high school, definitely I lost a lot of my friends. And for me, it was already kind of tough because I have a disability as well. And so I feel like I was already kind of this outsider. And so when I did get friends, it was hard. And so I would try my best to hold on to them. But at some point, my like home life and my friend life would combine and there would ultimately be something where either my friend or the parent of my friend would kind of sever that relationship. So yeah, just kind of figuring out who I was as an individual as well and being able to kind of do things on my own was very tough for me too. So I can definitely relate to that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think a lot of Christian families uh tend to have a lot of rules or a structure where they want their kids to follow a certain path. And it's, in my family, it's always framed of this is the fence, and you can live inside of this fence. But we get to say what that fence looks like. And I think there's this idea that if you do that for your children, they'll stay on the right path or they'll believe what you believe. And I think,
Mhm.
it's framed as a positive thing, but the experience of it can often be really limiting.
Yeah. And I could see, kind of trying to put myself in the shoes of a parent. I don't have kids yet, but I could imagine, religion aside, whatever it might be, wanting to protect them and wanting them to
Mhm.
succeed and kind of do the quote unquote right thing, or at least the thing I believe is the right thing. Like the intention semi being positive, but I also recognize that in a way it's still control.
Yeah, and I think that's a very human desire,
Mhm.
to want your kids to be okay. But a lot of times I think if it's fueled by fear or control, then that, it can get really damaging really fast.
Have you ever wondered what lurks in the dark and misty woods of the Pacific Northwest?
Or how Starbucks became the coffee giant we know today?
Why Oregon has so many serial killers?
Or if Bigfoot really poops in the woods?
Then you need to listen to the Rainy Day Rabbit Holes podcast. I'm Shay.
And I'm Jody.
Join us each week as we bring you the not-so-serious side of Pacific Northwest history.
On our show, you can hear great content like...
This wine smelled to me reminiscent of urinal cake.
Ooh, gosh.
And thoughtful insights like...
Next time I accidentally show up to one of these, I'm just going to whip my out.
There's your tip.
And then I'm going to say, no tip, we're even. Discover the charm and intrigue of this region like never before, where every raindrop leads to a new adventure.
If you like your history hysterical, Then join us every week.
Whether you're a Pacific Northwest native, a transplant, or just curious about the upper left corner of North America, this podcast is for you.
Subscribe to Rainy Day Rabbit Holes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts, and let the rain take you on a wild ride.
See you down the rabbit hole.
So in the book, Cait, you talk a lot about your dad, and a lot of this, I guess, storytelling revolves around him because he was like the leader of your family, being the patriarch, and, helped set that tone. And so I'm wondering, can you describe your relationship with your father when you were younger? And I think like around 11, there was kind of a change you recognized in your father. And so I'm wondering if you can kind of talk about what you remember about your relationship with him before this change, and then how did you see his mindset and behavior kind of pivot afterward?
My siblings often would say that I was my dad's favorite kid. And part of me hated that, and part of me really liked that because I liked feeling like I belonged or that my dad accepted me. But looking back, I know now that that was probably because I was really good at following the rules. But he was always very a charismatic person, very strong leader. And so it was always clear that he was the one making the rules. He was very passionate about what he believed. And, I was being taught that you honor your parents and that's honoring God. So I always thought, I always trusted him to take care of us because I thought that was how the world worked. I think he has some authoritarian tendencies. And so when I was around 11 and we were moving to Colorado and we started getting more into the Christian patriarchy movement, which is kind of this difficult thing to describe because it's not one church. A lot of people from different denominations are in this particular movement. And I remember we started getting something called Patriarch Magazine, which taught men that they were in charge and that women and children had to obey them. And then Vision Forum, which was they called themselves a ministry in Texas, started around that same time. And so my dad would go down there for conferences. And so all of this was happening at the same time. And these beliefs about patriarchy and how that's what God intended when he created Adam first, it infiltrated everything in our home. So our home is already pretty authoritarian, but then it gave this extra dynamic of this is what God says to do. And so it had this extra heavy layer of if you don't do this, then you're going to be punished for eternity. And so some things changed at that point. My dad said that we couldn't go to Sunday school anymore because there was this idea that you shouldn't segregate children by age. And we left the church we were going to and went to a much more patriarchal church, and everyone there thought the same way. And so I felt like I had already been isolated as a homeschooled kid, and now it felt even more isolated, if that was possible, because we were just only inside of this world. There was nothing else. Like we didn't go outside of this sphere of biblical patriarchy.
You kind of didn't get to be a kid at all. I could see Sunday school kind of being that escape where even though you're still in the church, you're still around other children, and now kind of being in this adult atmosphere. I don't know if you ever felt this way or not, but I do remember when I kind of quote unquote outgrew Sunday school, I remember being bored in kind of the bigger church with all of the adults. And so it was also just harder for me to pay attention. So I also kind of just see how it potentially could just add more to this, like kind of create more friction potentially.
Yeah, and you have to grow up really fast. I was only 10 or 11 at that time. And so, I'm being pulled out of Sunday school, made to sit in adult Sunday school. And then also being told, the courtship ideas started coming in. So being taught that I wasn't going to ever go on dates. My dad was going to help me find a husband. So all these ideas about marriage and having children when I'm a child myself, really forced me to grow up too fast.
Kind of the specific roles and like limitations that were placed upon women. So it's called, Christian patriarchy because the men in a way were seen as being quote unquote superior to women. And you had folks like, Kevin Swanson or like Patriarch magazine that were perpetuating these ideas and kind of painting pictures of, what men were supposed to be versus what women were supposed to be. So like when you think about when you were growing up, what were you told you were supposed to be as a woman when you grew up?
There's these cliches that we
Mhm.
that we would use, like Proverbs 31 woman, biblical woman. And what they meant was I was going to be a stay-at-home mom and homeschool my kids and have as many kids as God gave me because we were also against birth control. So, um, the idea was that I would run a household, I would cook and clean, and I learned how to sew. As a kid, I was being trained to do that. So my education was shaped around how to be a good wife and mother, and anything else wasn't important. So college wasn't an option. That would have just been too dangerous and a waste of time. Getting a career would have just taught me how to be an individual and think for myself. And so that was not a safe place for me to be. Going on dates would have been practice for divorce. So the courtship model was presented as the way to get married and stay married. So all of these ideas, it felt like my whole future was mapped out. And I didn't really have to think about anything. I just had to follow the rules, and then I would follow this path to getting married. But it turns out, being a human being and not a robot, that it doesn't didn't go over very well because I developed a lot of anxiety and depression from a young age, just
Mhm.
feeling so repressed. I never felt really excited about the whole marriage thing. I had friends who got married young, and it never really appealed to me to do that. I had dreams of going to music school and studying piano and playing professionally, but those were things I couldn't say out loud because there was no room for that in this idea of Christian patriarchy. So I just kept that to myself because I knew it wouldn't go over well. And I mean, what options did I have? And it's hard to explain to people because often people will say, oh, you were 18, you could just move out. But I didn't understand that I had legal rights as an adult. Nobody taught me that. And I was told you're a child until you get married. And I didn't have I didn't have sufficient education or work experience to leave at that time. Plus, just psychologically being trapped. It was difficult to have to imagine anything else.
Mhm.
And I remember, like, my grandmother would ask me, like, why aren't you going to college? And I would just say that the script I'd been given, I'm going to be a stay-at-home wife and mother, blah, blah, blah. And then what's interesting, though, is at my homeschool graduation, we had a statewide homeschool graduation ceremony. In the bulletin, they listed everyone's plans. Now, I was the only one, and my father wrote mine. So I was the only one that didn't have any plans other than getting married. So even other girls in the homeschooling community were going to college just to get an education, even if they were going to become wives and mothers. And so even then I was separate, in a sense, because I wasn't even allowed to have more education.
You've mentioned, being a stay-at-home mother slash wife, but for a long time, you identified as being a stay-at-home daughter, which was a role that you essentially assumed after graduating. I had never heard this phrase before I read your book, and I really appreciate how simple yet loaded this label is. And so I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit more about what this looked like for you being a stay-at-home daughter?
Yeah, I believe the term came from Vision Forum or just the quiverful movement. I'm not sure who came up with it first, but it was a term that girls like me were called. Their Vision Forum even created they called it a documentary, but really it was propaganda about what a stay-at-home daughter is. And it was called Return of the Daughters. And it just showed girls like me living at home and submitting to their dads until they get married. And that was the whole idea was you're being in training to be a stay-at-home mother. So until that time, you're a stay-at-home daughter and you're submitting to your father and learning how to serve him as practice for how to serve your future husband. So sometimes people use the term emotional incest because it's really a strange way to create this father-daughter relationship where there's this control dynamic and um, you're kind of practicing being a wife by making your dad dinner and ironing his clothes. Um, that's what my life was like. I was told this is what you're going to be, and I thought if I obeyed that, that's what God wanted me to do. Yeah, it was like a way to make it sound, I think, like a valid lifestyle by giving it this name.
I don't know if this was intentional or not, but hearing you say the word emotional incest, one thing that kept sticking out to me as I was reading your book, especially as you got a little bit older, was when you talked about, whether you were greeting your father or saying goodbye to him, how it wasn't that he would, hug you and give you a kiss on the cheek or the top of your head, but you always kind of said that he would kiss your neck, which I thought was kind of interesting because, to me, the neck kind of seems like a very intimate place to be kissed. And not that I don't think that you were necessarily alluding to anything beyond that, but I think that that's so interesting now that you say the phrase emotional incest.
I write about that in a specific scene in the book where
Mm-hmm.
it was right after he had told me he couldn't walk me down the aisle at my wedding because I had disobeyed him.
Yeah.
So this is later in the book. And he did that, and it just felt so invasive. I was 24, I think, at the time. It felt so invasive and so intimate, and like he was showing ownership
Mm.
over me, and that he was the one who could love me, and I wasn't allowed to go love anybody else unless he gave me permission. So, I mean, I think it can be a really descriptive term to use in those situations. It felt bad.
Yeah.
And he did that again years later after I had left, and I had the worst panic attack of my life afterwards. And so I think our bodies know when something's wrong and remember. And so, yeah, even now talking about it, like that was one of the hardest things to write about, because it might not have seemed so harmful if you were witnessing it, but what it felt like control. It felt like I was property.
Yeah. And I picked up on that too. Not I didn't really grow up with my dad. But I do remember anytime being around my mother, especially after I left home, as soon as I got near her, my body would just tense up and
Hmm.
I would have a bunch of nerves. And I just remember kind of feeling, I don't like kind of feeling like something's crawling all over me in a
Yeah,
way, because it's like, it's almost like my body's just telling me danger, danger, toxicity, go away, go away. So I
yeah.
definitely kind of understand that, like, just bodily reaction that happens in an
Hmm.
emotional like an overly charged emotional experience.
Yeah. And I think, for so long I was dissociated, so I didn't have those reactions until more of like the later years before I left and like after I left. So the more I became embodied and connected to my physical presence, the more I felt this anxiety. And I think it's because my body's trying to tell me something's wrong. And I listen to that more now, now that I'm far, far away. But I think our bodies can give us signals of what feels safe and what's not.
This idea of courtship is something that you experienced starting as a teenager. So in mainstream, quote unquote America, we have this idea of, dating. Not that courtship, I think, is like this alien idea, but I know that there are some differences between these two traditions. And so I was wondering, could you kind of talk about from your perspective, how is courtship date different from what you know as dating today, and what did your courtship practices look like?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because dating and relationships have always looked different depending on the culture and time period you're in. So I don't think that there's one right way to do something, but
Mhm.
I think from what I observed growing up, dating was um well, also it's very heterosexual. So like I'll just stick with what I was taught because the idea of gay relationships was like not even in existence in our home. But it was like, a boy and a girl going out by themselves, driving in a car by themselves, going to the movies, just having fun and not talking about anything serious. Basically, I was taught that was wasting time and giving your heart to somebody who's not your future spouse. Nowadays, I think of dating as it can be a really healthy way to get to know yourself and who you want to be in partnership with, if you want to be in partnership with somebody. And it can be, a healthy way to be in relationship with other people by dating. Um, but courtship was based on this idea that dating is practice for divorce. So dating is wrong. And courtship would be father controlled. And so you think of it like this like little triangle of like the father and then the two perspective um, man and woman with the father in between guiding their relationship. And so courtship could look different depending on your family. My family followed a courtship guide called The Pathway to Christian Marriage, which sounds really culty, because it is. The idea was you would go through all of these questions with your father and the other person, and over a few months determine whether you were eligible to get married to each other. And so you would not have any private time. You would always have a chaperone if you went anywhere together. You would not be allowed to talk about things that might make you emotional, like strange things like don't talk about where you want to live someday because that might make the other person imagine life with you. It's kind of backwards, but it's very intellectualized where you're just thinking through, is this person the right kind of Christian that I should marry? So basically, what was really happening was, is the man patriarchal and is the woman going to submit to that? That's really what was happening. You get to the end of this courtship process, and then the man's supposed to ask the father if they can get married. And if the father says yes, then he can ask the woman and she can say yes. She can also say no, but in this lifestyle, it's very limited choices. So often it wouldn't feel as if that's a real choice, especially if your father approves of it. And then you would become betrothed. And in my family, we would sign a betrothal covenant where you're basically promising to get married to that person. as like a vow to God. And so it was all very weighted with this idea of this is what God wants you to do. And if you break the rules or if you have feelings or love for someone you're not betrothed or married to, then you are sinning against God by having the wrong emotions or not having your emotions in control. So it took purity culture to the extreme and not just sexual purity, but emotional purity as well. I went through one full courtship and it was very harmful because you don't get to know the other person. You don't have a sense of self in that relationship. And it's basically very dehumanizing to have a relationship in that way. And I don't think it builds healthy marriages the way they were promised. It's a flawed method. It seems scientific, but really it's based on cherry-picked verses from the Old Testament, and so it's already a flawed method. And then you're just expecting people to not be human beings and just go through the motions and figure out who's the best match for you, based on some, you know, logical conclusion that your father comes to. So yeah, it's very problematic to put it simply.
Yeah. And I remember your father was very involved in your courtship. And I remember one time, this is when you were uh, dating Will, I believe, and you share later on in the story that there were probably other reasons why you and Will didn't end up together. But I remember you described your father sitting in the couch, and then that triangle again of each you and Will on each side of him, kind of going back and answering questions. And I also remember your father, making decisions for you about guys that you were courting and, kind of dictating what emotions you were supposed to have, or, actually saying you weren't supposed to have any emotions. So I'm wondering, how do you think your father kind of influenced your idea of what love and intimacy and emotions were supposed to look like when it came to a relationship?
Yeah, he definitely tried to influence what I thought about that, but I think I
Mhm.
always had this idea that it was not correct.
Mhm.
I had witnessed other women getting married in this way, especially my sister, and not having this perfectly happy marriage afterwards and not seeing like they were in love. And I think maybe I just was always a little bit of a hopeless romantic in that way. And I don't know where I picked that up from.
Yeah.
Um, but just this idea that I could fall in love and that's what I wanted for myself. And so even though my dad was telling me these things, I tried to obey them because I thought that's what I should do. But in the back of my head, I was wanting more. I was hoping that we would fall in love, which is probably why I got so much trouble because I did have feelings for the man I was in a courtship with, and then I got in trouble for having those feelings. So, that kind of sparked me wanting to leave in the first place, of realizing I can't be sorry for loving somebody. I can't apologize for that. I don't think God would punish me for loving someone. So that's the love, this belief that someone could love another unconditionally was really a big instigation for me leaving.
While you're still living at home, you're starting to kind of go through this like personal transformation. And around the same time that you're considering finally leaving home, you meet a character in your story. No, sorry, I don't want to paint it as a character as if they're fictional, but I know that you use pseudonyms to kind of anonymize the people.
Mhm.
But you meet David, who happens to be the son of the pastor of the church you are involved with, and you're kind of going through this personal transformation. And David, I think, comes in, and then like your father kind of complicates this a bit because it doesn't seem like he's on board with David. And so I think that in a way kind of perpetuates your response, and you like, kind of searching for what's really happening with you and kind of the way you were raised. Like, how does this whole thing go down with David and your father? And kind of like, what's the link between that relationship and kind of your own personal transformation?
Yeah. And like most things in life, it's very, very messy story.
Yeah.
Um, well, also just off the first point, David is the only person that I don't use a pseudonym with. So that's actually his real name because
Oh,
um my publisher wanted me to change anyone who's not, married to me just to protect their privacy. So that's his real name. But I had this other courtship first, and then my father ended it. I was heartbroken. I thought to myself, I'm never going to let this happen to me again. And I started thinking about ways to save money and possibly leave. And so I started teaching piano lessons. And that was the one kind of job that I could do because, I was teaching homeschooled kids. I didn't have a boss who was a man. And saying this out loud sounds crazy, but that's literally what I was told, that I couldn't have a job if it was under a man. So that was one way that I could save money, and that took a long time. So I was doing that. I was processing things mentally, not talking about it at all. And then I met David, and I developed this deep friendship with him. And he, would ask me things like, "What do you like to read? And what do you think about this?" And uh, no man had ever asked me that before. And so it was just this beautiful developing of a relationship where we started as friends and slowly fell in love. And David went to my dad to ask for a courtship just because it seemed like the easiest way to get this to work. And my dad said yes for about a week, and then he changed his mind. And he came up with some new rules that David had to follow before that we could have a relationship. And I was already thinking, this is not happening again, because at this point, my dad has stopped me from having relationships several times. And I didn't want to let David go. And so we continued like saying we were friends, but really we were kind of dating just very secretly. Um, and eventually decided we wanted to get married. And that's around the same time when everything, all the crap was hitting the fan, at my home. And I was trying to figure out what was happening to me, what the emotional abuse was. I didn't have language for that. I wanted to leave and have my own choices. And David was there with me through that. And so the more he learned about what my home life was like, the more he stuck by me and helped me escape in a sense. Because, like, for one example, he helped me go get my first cell phone, so that I could have a way to contact people. And so yeah, we had that relationship. Then we decided to move away together and start our lives over. And that entailed a lot of excitement, but also a lot of loss because I did have to leave, this whole movement, my family. It felt like I was breaking everything up and that I was the problem, but I knew I wouldn't survive living there anymore. I experienced a lot of spiritual abuse and emotional abuse. And I write about some different kinds of examples in the book of how I felt manipulated and controlled. There's this one scene where my dad is yelling at me because he thinks I'm a feminist now. And so I run out the front door and I start just running up the street. Like my body just went into like flight mode. And then he chased me down and brought me home like I was a little kid. I was 24. That's one of the ups and downs of what was happening in my home. Of once I started talking for myself and saying, I want to do this, I don't want to do that. That's when my dad started amping up all of this kind of behavior towards me. And I finally had access to a computer, and started looking up. I don't know what words I typed in, but I was trying to figure out what was happening because I felt sick. I felt like this can't be normal, And so I found this article about emotional abuse and I was just like shocked because I was like, this has all happened to me. And I didn't know what to do with that information. I still had this sense of wanting to do things the right way and wanting my dad to give my dad the chance to make things right. And so I printed out the article and I gave it to him and I highlighted the aspects that I thought applied. Very naive thing to do because he obviously didn't react well. I mean, who would react to that well, if someone's saying you're abusing me? So especially someone who is abusive, they get very defensive. So that didn't go over well. Everything was just confirming my sense that I needed to leave. And so it became very fraught relationship with threats like, I can't walk you down the aisle. I'm not sure if I can come to your wedding. You're disobeying God, to like, I love you, like the opposite. I love you. I want what's best for you. So this gaslighting and manipulation was happening all the time. And it was making me feel like I was insane. And so leaving eventually felt like this relief, from all of that.
Hi, my wonderful goat friends. Firstly, thank you so much for your support and listening. If you're enjoying this conversation and other episodes of the podcast, I'd like to ask you to please give us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple, or whichever platform you are listening on right now. And if you're so inclined, we'd love to hear your feedback in a full review. Also, might be a great idea to hit subscribe on that platform you're listening to right now so you can get notified of new episodes as they are released. Thank you so much again for being one of our loyal GOAT listeners. And I know that you've kind of alluded to this a little bit, but after leaving home, you described many times where you've kind of had like these post-traumatic stress disorder reactions or like panic attacks. And I to this day, at least once or twice a year, will wake up in a shivering sweat because of having a nightmare, either of a specific memory that actually happened or of a hypothetical memory of, my mom was very physically abusive as well as emotionally abusive. But I remember one thing for me that I struggled with as a child, and I was the oldest, so I always felt personally responsible for my younger siblings. And so I just remember feeling so helpless, not being able to kind of stand up and protect my siblings. So I'll have these nightmares of just one of my siblings being attacked and me not being able, like kind of being paralyzed, not being able to do anything about it. So I can relate, I think, to some of those experiences that you had. And so I'm wondering, how did you work through those? And I know you had David alongside you. What was your strategy for working through that? And do those still impact you today?
Yeah, I'm sorry that you've had to experience that too. And I think it's with the nightmares, our subconscious is processing things that maybe we don't want to think about during the day.
Yeah.
And it's interesting when I think the first year or two after I left, I was going to community college and I took an intro to psychology class and we were talking about nightmares. And I was like, well, I don't think even I asked. I think someone else asked, how do you feel better after a nightmare? And I think everybody has nightmares, but I think when you have PTSD, it's very specific to your trauma, and that feeling of helplessness. So she said, get out of bed, walk around, and like remind yourself of where you are. And if you go right back to sleep instead of doing that, you'll go right back into that feeling. But if you get up and like shift your body a little bit, it can help you get out of that state. And so that was like before I could afford therapy, that was helpful to know that there were ways to deal with this kind of thing. I still had nightmares, but it helped me get out of them. And so when I finally could afford therapy, I did EMDR therapy, which is a trauma therapy that helps you reprocess traumatic memory. And that was the first time I felt like I stopped having the worst night terrors, um, because it felt like I had gone through the memory. I mean, it's really difficult uh, to do this therapy because it's really emotional, but reprocessing and feeling them in a safe place helped me get them out of my system a little bit. And so the worst nightmares went away after that, which is amazing. I still do get nightmares sometimes. And depending, like, I think now, especially, I'm talking about this a lot and my book is out. So I think that just may be top of mind. But what helps me now is this, this is might sound crazy, but like just taking melatonin and some CBD at night tones down my dreams because I have very lucid, very vivid dreams in general. And so having something to like sedate me a little bit keeps them from being too crazy. And so I might still have stressful dreams, but they're not quite as traumatic with the CBD. So that's where I'm at today. I hope that one day I don't have those at all, but I think, I'm only 11 years away from all of this, and it takes a lot of time to recover.
It does. Yeah, I think it's good to remind yourself of that and to just strive for 1% each day versus thinking you have to just do this complete 180 overnight.
Yeah, and it's like we can transfer that harsh punishment to ourselves by saying like, oh, well, I'm not healed enough, or
Mhm.
why didn't I get better faster? But I think that's just perpetuating the harm, and we need to have compassion for ourselves because we didn't ask for this. It's something we've got to go through to heal. It takes time.
And you saying that too, I, for the longest time, would not even talk about anything as it related to my childhood, whether it was around the religious trauma, the physical abuse, emotional abuse. I even, unfortunately, experienced sexual abuse too. But I felt so ashamed for that being my experience. And
Mhm.
I don't remember exactly when it was, but it wasn't too long ago that I finally had the realization that I was a child. I had no control over
Yeah.
the type of environment I was born into, that I was raised in. I was like, why am I ashamed? Like, it's not like I chose that as a child, like, oh, I want to grow up in this type of environment. It's like,
Hmm.
for me, that just helped so much to kind of open myself to having like authentic conversations about my experience because yeah, I felt so ashamed. And I think for the longest time, it was because I was being judged and bullied as a child
Yeah.
because of my experiences. But I finally got to that place, and I hope others can as well.
Yeah. And like that shame doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the
Mhm.
abusers, but they're not going to do that, right? So they're putting it on you. And I used to feel so much anger to myself because I didn't leave right away, or I didn't speak up for myself, or I didn't, do this, and that. And sometimes now people will even say that to me because they don't believe my story. And it just echoes the own voice in my head of saying this doesn't matter and, doubting myself. But I'm learning to show compassion for that earlier self because she didn't know better. She didn't have resources. I mean, the amount of isolation and when you are in different kinds of abuse, like it changes your brain, right? So it's not like you asked for that to happen to you and you didn't deserve it. And then we have all this shame, but we have to come to terms with we didn't ask for that at all. It's not our fault, even though there are going to be people who will blame us. Um, and that's a whole nother conversation, the victim blaming. But that's not okay. And we need to shift how we think about abuse and harm, because we're keeping people from healing by making them feel more shame about it.
Well, Cait, your memoir, Rift, is officially out. And so I'm wondering why did you call the book Rift and what motivated you to actually write your story and share it with the world?
Yeah, like you, I didn't used to talk about my childhood at all. I wanted to just not ever talk about it ever again. And then I had PTSD and my body wouldn't let me forget. So I had to go through all that processing, and I went to college to study writing because I wanted to finally do something for myself. And that's where I started writing my story in little bits and little stories. Eventually that became my creative thesis, was the beginning of this book. And at first it was for me, of just trying to make something creative out of what I had experienced. And then the more I shared online and talked to people, I realized there's a lot of people who have gone through these kinds of things in different forms. And nobody in the stay-at-home daughter movement has been talking about this. And so I wanted to create something that could help others feel seen, and that would help me um, get this story out of I say out of my body and onto the page, because that's how it feels. It feels like it was stuck and I needed to write it down, and now it's out of me, and it can go do its own work in the world. So that's why I wrote it. Different, complex reasons. And the idea of Rift has always been there from the beginning. I was studying creative nonfiction at the time, and how to integrate research into nonfiction writing and personal narrative. And I was studying the way the Rocky Mountains evolved and formed over time. And that's where I lived in Colorado. So I made first this essay of parts of my story, and then braided it together with this story of how the mountains formed. And that led me to this idea of a rift in geology where the earth tears apart, and there's no going back from that. And that just became this bigger metaphor as I was writing everything, of what is a rift, what is separation, what does that mean? In one sense, it shows this binary of the before and the after. But on the other hand, it's more complicated than that. And so I use this metaphor of like how when the earth splits apart in a rift, if you go deep enough, it's still the same, like the materials, the rocks that form the tectonic plates are the same. And so that kind of helped me shape how I want to talk about trauma and generational trauma, and how it feels to leave something like this. So that sounds like I'm rambling, but it's a bigger metaphor that I use throughout the book. And that's why I went with it, because it has this geology aspect, but it feels really meaningful for what I experienced.
With Rift now out in the world and, kind of, weaving its own power, it has the potential to potentially impact other women who might have had similar experiences to you and help change the trajectory of their lives. And when you think about the barriers you had to overcome, what what advice do you have for anyone who might be in a similar situation to you and trying to figure out how to overcome those barriers and separate from their trauma?
Is difficult. And I just want people to feel seen. Like, this is not an easy thing to do. For me, it felt like I had to do it to survive. And if that's you, I'm sorry that you're in a situation like that, because it's hard. If there is like personal safety concerns, I always say call the police and go to get some actual like help right away. You can also call the domestic violence hotline If you Google that, they have a website, and you can chat or you can call them um, for immediate help, and for talking through with someone who's safe. So if that's what you need right away, do that. If you feel like you're not in immediate danger, then take your time to think through what you want. And that might be finding some space to be by yourself and connect with your inner, like your intuition and your true voice, to feel safe and feel like you can think through what you want out of your life. And that's okay. Like, I want to give people permission, like, it's okay to think about what you want. I was taught that was wrong. So that's why I say that. So once you do that, and then you can start to build resources, right? So like for me, I had to save money, and I found a loophole by teaching piano, things like that, where you can work to save up resources and also gather mental strength, because this is going to take some work. And then find support wherever you can. Don't listen to the people who want to keep you trapped or controlled. Don't listen to their opinions or them telling you what you need to do to live your life. Listen to the people who want you to be safe, who want you to be yourself, who want you to be happy. Those are the kind of people that you can build trust with and start to get some support. And so there are organizations that can help you. I work specifically with Tears of Eden, which is a nonprofit for spiritual abuse survivors. We do have some resources on our website and some support groups. There's also an organization called the Vashti Initiative, and that has a hotline as well. It's very specific to this kind of spiritual abuse and this, religious trauma too. So both of those resources are really helpful. And just going online, if you can find access to social media or the internet, I mean, if you're listening to this podcast, hopefully that means you do, or like go to the library. You can find so many people talking about this now on Instagram, for instance, and it'll help you see that there's options. You don't have to live like any specific person, but it helps to see the different ways that you can live. And then you can make your own choices. And all of this is practicing your agency when you've been controlled and you're not allowed to be independent. So you need to practice making decisions and thinking for yourself, and give yourself grace, because that takes time to feel comfortable doing.
And also pick up a copy of your book, because I think also listening, going through and reading someone else's story that might be similar to yours, I think can have so much power in it as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. I hope so.
Yeah. One more question for you, Cait, before we sign off. So the name of this podcast is called Not Your Average Goat, goat standing for greatest of all time, which is all commonly a phrase used in the sports world to describe, phenomenal sports players like Abby Wambach or LeBron James. And everyone I bring on this show, I believe, is a goat in their own way. And I think the rest of the world should know more about them. And so I love to close the show by asking my guests, who or what for you has been your goat in life?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people I could say. For this conversation, what comes to mind is Tara Westover, who wrote the memoir Educated a few
Such a
years
great
ago.
book.
Yeah, and I think she really opened the door for a lot of us who are telling our stories now, because she grew up fundamentalist Mormon, and the story is about her finding a way to leave and go to college and get this education after the abuse she experienced. And I think it just I felt really seen reading that, and I felt like it could help me explain to others who I am. And so I think she's done a lot of work with that book. It's a lot of people have read it, and a lot of people have a more contextualized understanding of what this kind of abuse looks like. So a shout out to Tara Westover for writing that. I know it was difficult, and I'm just really grateful.
It's so funny you say that because I was actually going to ask you if you had ever read that book because I read that a couple of years ago. And as I was reading your book, there was definitely some parallels. I know it's very different in its own way. But yeah, that book also really spoke to me as well from my experience.
Mhm.
So highly recommend that as well.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Cait, for your time today. I will be linking to your book in the show notes as well as your website, but I really appreciate you coming onto the show and talking to me this morning.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a lovely conversation.
Not Your Average Goat is produced and edited by yours truly, with music by Sergey Quadrado and Anton Blazov. All content is copyrighted and should not be recreated, reproduced, or reused without explicit consent. Please visit notyouraveragegoat.org/contact for questions.